All right, I am here with Alexander Mercurs, the Oracle of London in London, and I've got with me the great Robert Barnes. Robert Barnes, where can people find you?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
And I will put a link to that information down below in the description box. We are going to cover a lot of ground on a lot of topics, everybody. We'll be talking about OSHA, going to the Supreme Court, going to SCOTUS. We'll touch upon Assange. Maybe we'll touch upon Ghislaine. And I know we got a verdict coming out there pretty soon, any day now. So we'll get into that trial as well. But first, let's talk about fertilizer. Alexander, or the lack of fertilizer. And this is directly connected to the energy crisis and natural gas. We've been covering this from a geopolitical standpoint, but we've got an energy problem and we've got a fertilizer problem. What's going on here, Alexander?
Yeah, I mean, fertilizer, when one says that word, people probably say to themselves, well, this is going to be very interesting. I mean, what am I interested in fertilizer for? Fertilizer is absolutely crucial. It is fundamentally important because the way the mass of humanity that exists today, the way we've all become accustomed to eat, we can't exist in the way that we do without chemical fertilizers to get our soils in a position where they can produce food in sufficient quantities to feed the world. Now, what has happened is that as a result of energy policies, which have been, shall we say, problematic, across the industrialized world, especially the western part of the industrialized world, especially the European and North American part of the industrialized world, we are at this moment in time short of natural gas. We're going into winter with shortages of natural gas. This is particularly acute in Europe, where, of course, the switch to green energy has been much faster than I think it's been in the United States. And that, in effect, has meant greater dependence on natural gas. In Europe today, the windmills, all those things that are producing the alternative energy, they're not producing as much energy as expected because of the still weather. There's been very little weather. The Russians have not been pumping to Europe as much gas as is needed to cover energy needs this winter. The result is that natural gas, which is the primary product out of which fertilizer is produced, chemical fertilizer is produced, is being used for heating and power generation instead of being used for making chemical fertilizer. And there just are starting to be accumulating shortages around the world of fertilizer. And that means that going into 2022, there will be less fertilizer, less food production. We already have rising prices all over the world. Every part of the world now is experiencing rising food prices. And this is going to crank up that process even further. And it might even cause famine conditions in some places. Places like Egypt, for example, places like parts of Africa. So desperate situations there. Political problems quite likely in those sort of places. But of course, in the West, we might not be facing famine conditions, but we're going to have a further upward spike in prices, in food prices, over and above the problems that we already have as a result of the out of control financial and economic policies that we've talked about so often in our programs, with the administration spending money in a way that is, I think completely reckless and which is generating inflation in the way that it is. That's a summary of the position at the moment, at least as I understand it.
Transitory inflation, Robert, huh? How's Biden going to handle this?
No doubt. I mean, I think it reflects, it's a micro example of the macro impact that you guys discuss all the time so well, which is, it's a sign of the geopolitics, eco-politics combined with globalism creating these kind of problems that seem almost unanticipated. For people that are out there wondering, why do I care what's happening on the Ukraine-Russia border? Why do I care what's happening in Belarus? It's because these little aspects add up, and they ultimately may add up to the cost of bread at your local bakery. And this is how and this is why it does so. And it's also a reflection that you would have thought we kind of should have learned from the whole pandemic, which is, and what we're seeing and witnessing in the supply chain issues now, which is a weakness of globalism. Was the whole premise of globalism from an economic theory was, let's let people somewhere in the world who are the best at this dominate whatever this is at some part of the supply chain. And what happens is it ends up creating a lot of monopolies effectively, or disproportionate. Some little part of the world had disproportionate control of some piece of the supply chain of something, whether it's food, goods, whatever it is. Well, what happens when that piece of the supply chain is no longer available and you can't substitute quickly because you've built this globalistic economy in the way that you have? You end up with all of a sudden spikes, random spikes in all kinds of things because you do sanctions on Belarus. There's an important product they export that's now removed from the regular supply chain in terms of economic cost, price spikes. All of a sudden that has a trickle effect all the way across the whole world to where it literally shows up in your loaf of bread. And this is an example, and it doesn't appear that this current administration has any clue about this in any meaningful way. They keep stepping in it and then stepping in it and then stepping in it and stepping in it, and it's extraordinary. It's like watching Alec Baldwin try to defend himself. He just digs deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's what the Biden administration has done, and a little bit terrifying to witness, but maybe all too predictable for those who are paying deep attention.
Absolutely. Now, the important point, and I'm glad you brought up globalization, because this is the problem. This is exactly why this has risen. If you think about the United States and its political and economic history, the United States, for most of its history, has been essentially a self-contained, self-sufficient economic continental economy. It was partly designed to be that way. I mean, I can remember, when I did my history studies, and I should say I studied the history of the United States and found it fascinating and inspiringly interesting. There was what you used to call the American system. I don't know whether that's something that an expression that's used in the United States itself, but Europeans refer to it as the American system, often attributed to Alexander Hamilton, but actually it evolved over a long period of time. And it was not globalist at all. It looked to develop the United States on the basis of its own resources. And the result was that the United States was incredibly resilient. It was not concerned by the fact that a single manufacturer of phosphate in Belarus, of all places, as it turns out, produces 20% of the world's phosphate. So there's a problem there that creates a massive spike in bread prices in the United States. That just didn't happen. The economic history of the United States, the reason the United States became a global power is because within the United States, you had free enterprise. You really did. You had free enterprise. You had policies against cartelization, much more advanced than anything you had in Europe. There was a concern and suspicion of monopoly. But at the same time, there was always this understanding that this economic environment that existed in the United States should be one that was to a great extent self-contained. And that was what made America the powerhouse and the stable part of the world economy. Globalization has destroyed that. It's integrated. It was supposed to benefit American consumers. It's taken away, in my opinion, a lot of American industry, a lot of American jobs, and it now means that if there's a problem with a phosphate producer in Belarus, it translates into food prices in the United States. Anyway, that's my little rant, if you like, about globalization. But it's always amazed me and puzzled me that Americans, with this tremendous tradition, this history, this economic philosophy that they had behind them, have lost that and have drifted into this globalist Adam Smith-like system where, you have the invisible hand and everybody is everything, you go to who is the most efficient producer, which creates, exactly as Robert said, global monopolies in particular places.
Yeah, but this was self-inflicted, Robert, wasn't it? I mean, the first thing that Biden did when he got into office, he went after the energy industry. I mean, he shut down Keystone right away. And you can make a good argument that Trump was following an America. I mean, he was following an America First policy, and much of what Alexander was explaining was kind of the philosophy of America First. But the first thing Biden did when he got into office, he said, Keystone's gone. We're going to go after the energy industry. This is like a self-inflicted wound in a way. I mean, the Biden administration seems to be doing this to itself. The inflation they've done it.
Yeah, Trump was deeply committed to making the U.S. energy independent as much as possible for the first time in a long time, and was on track to achieve that objective. And of course, Biden's gone the opposite direction. The undermining the coal industry, undermining the natural gas industry, undermining the oil industry, undermining almost everything that's domestic production oriented, while making us even more dependent than before on foreign supplies. And you look at the aggregate consequences of his policies. He continues to exacerbate the inflation issue with the way in which they just keep printing and printing and printing and printing without restriction. So much so the Fed is now talking about jacking up interest rates, but is terrified to do so because it might sink the housing and stock markets. We're caught in a kind of position like Turkey is. In other words, George Gammon, who does a lot of good economic analysis, was saying the Americans should pay attention to Turkey because we're creating the same inflation or interest rate problem that now faces Erdogan. That when hey, we got to keep interest rates low because I got to keep my construction pals happy, but inflation's out of control at such a level that almost it's lose-lose no matter which way they go. Where if the Fed in the United States kind of in that position, they want to raise interest rates because inflation turned out to be not so transitory. But if they do, what does that do to the stock market? What does that do to the housing market? I mean, George Gammon did a good breakdown. He said, look, if interest rates go from 4% to 8%, all of a sudden you need twice as much equity to afford your home. All of a sudden the ball game totally radically changes overnight. And right now in the United States, we've been kind of keeping parts of the economy artificially afloat through excess capital in the housing and stock markets. What happens when that comes down? And Biden's only answer is print, 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 print. Wow. They're going to accelerate and escalate their harassment of the oil industry. They're going to issue new regulations. They love all these emergency powers they now have that they've been, if they can do vaccine mandates in the name of emergency powers, there's nothing they can't do in the name of emergency powers. And they're going to start using this to institute a climate change agenda domestically within the United States, which I'm sure China will be happy to see them see. It's not like China's not doing any climate change strategy anytime soon. If people want to see where all the coal manufacturing is taking place these days, but it's a particular ironic time to do it, as you note, because you have all these inflationary pressures. You have fuel shortages. We may start to have fertilizer shortages that might lead to food shortages. And in the middle of all this, we're going to start instituting policies that undermine American economic independence, energy independence, and energy capability and productivity. It's mind-numbing, but this is what happens when the idiots get to run the asylum.
Absolutely, and it's
Alexander.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. Well, Robert mentioned Turkey, so you may. I mean, we've talked about Turkey a lot. I think that's a very good comparison. Also, guys, we have the news that came from Fox News this morning, or was it yesterday morning, that Manchin is pretty much not going to, at least for now, not going to sign on Biden's Build Back Better. I mean, it's a blessing in disguise for the Biden administration, for the United States. But obviously, the squad and a lot of the progressives they're going absolutely crazy with the fact that Manchin's not on board of what was going to be around a $5 trillion package. They said 2.5, but it was going to be around 5 trillion. But anyway, you may want to comment on that as well.
Well, what I just very quickly wanted to say, and I'm glad you mentioned this, because it takes us back to exactly what Robert said about using executive orders in effect to override Congress. Because directly in the run-up to Manchin making that announcement, we were able to see that this was going to come. We have an article in The Guardian, which is, of course, a British newspaper, but I've come to realise that the administration often likes to float ideas in The Guardian and the British media, which are then brought back to the US, and I think they think that if they do that, there's some kind of positive feedback loop that, the British are saying that you should do this, so let's do this in America. There is a whole article which says that what Biden needs to do is he needs to forget about Congress and do all of this by executive order. I mean, exactly what Robert said. I'll send you a link to the article once we finish. And it specifically refers to the green agenda. It says, it talks about abolishing cancelling student debt. All student debt below a certain level should be cancelled by executive order. And I just read this and I'm just shaking my head. I'm saying to myself, do you have an elected president, or do you have Caesar? Because this is government by Caesar. This is Emperor Biden doing these sort of things. But this is now actually being advocated. And coming back to the earlier point, if these policies were successful, if they were achieving some, great objective. I mean, FDR did lots of things by decree, and he stretched the Constitution. He ran into problems with the Supreme Court, all sorts of things, but at least he was sort of successful. But this isn't even successful. It's creating problems at every level. You see that with the inflation. You see that with, all the other policies. You see that with the loss of energy security. And it's using decree powers to make things worse. I mean, I've never known anything like this. I have never known a government that deliberately, almost, I say deliberately, actively works to undermine its own economy. It's something that just leaves me astonished. I find it very difficult to understand. But anyway, the talk now is, if Congress won't do it for us, we'll do it by decree instead.
And more mandates, Robert, and more mandates. OSHA. I mean, they're not going to give up.
I agree. I enjoy you guys' historical series because you could do an almost perfect analogy to what's happening right now to the Chancellor in Weimar Germany towards the end, where he's like, okay, what do we do? Well, we'll just keep asserting emergency powers and bail out these buddies and bail out those buddies. And how did using that emergency exception turn out for Germany? A little fella had a different idea how to utilize that emergency exception.